That very same chilling feeling came back to me again. It was fear, just pure, overwhelming fear. Fear for my loved ones. I'm from Melitopol. Right now, this city is occupied. Of course, it's a Ukrainian provincial, you could say, small town. Up until around 2014, post-Soviet times. But after those events, the revolution of dignity, something changed in the consciousness, probably of all Ukrainians, and in Melitopol as well. Changes started happening everywhere. Even in the former environment, the authorities began to act for the people and so on. Many beautiful locations were created and parks were restored as well. We even started to feel proud of our little town. And then the war happened. And what I least expected from our city was that people would unite like that. It was captured very quickly without significant destruction, unlike what happened in Mariupol. But once people recovered a little, they started gathering and, as usual, began to protest against what was happening. An absolutely huge crowd would gather. It seemed to me that there were up to 10,000 people. And there was quite an interesting story there. The churches, I am a church minister, also joined in the square for prayer. We usually gathered on Easter or for other such holidays, just for these kinds of events, like the city holiday. We were called upon, so we gathered together to pray. And there the priests stood separately. They gathered for prayer and sang hymns. And next to them, the community gathered. And there was this funny incident. Nearby, of course, was a large crowd, townspeople, and they were singing. Putin, la 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 la. At that moment, the priests were singing, God, I pray for Ukraine. The churchmen looked at each other and thought, something about it felt wrong. There was some kind of dissonance. So they said, let's do something about it. And then they talked to the organizers of this rally and decided to start the rally with a prayer. And then everyone would disperse. And there were some slogans being chanted, but they also asked that, well, and the slogans should be without swear words because, first of all, they're not truly Ukrainian. And secondly, it was very jarring to the ear. But in this way, the community came together and defended their Ukrainian city. Here's another story that I remembered. Of course, it began. The occupation, chaos, schools weren't working, medical facilities weren't operating, stores were looted. There was even, this sense that, well, our townspeople became so refined, or maybe they had always been that way. It just became apparent during the war. But there are always provocateurs. And of course, Russian soldiers smashed a store window and said, come on, loot. Or something like that, some kind of slogan, but no one went. And then they themselves, they provoked it and the crowd ran after them. This is just the background, how everything was happening. There was a lot of staging, They brought in humanitarian aid, people rushed in, journalists filmed everything, filmed the humanitarian aid, and then went somewhere else to show how they were saving Ukrainians from starvation. We didn't need to be saved, we had more than enough of our own. On the contrary, we were the ones feeding others. We simply didn't need to take what was ours. But at that time, the church was doing a lot of service. And it became, a kind of humanitarian hub. And a lot of aid was coming in back then. well, there was still a connection with the free territory from various international organizations, from Ukrainian ones as well. Communities and the church received a lot of food products. There was a great need and so on. That's how the church served at that time. And in our church, which is located right across from the pedagogical university, we have a lot of teachers, both those who studied at the university and those who taught there. So we gathered together and thought about it. Why should our children have to lose this time? Let's provide education, at least the kind we can, for the children of parents we know, because it wasn't safe to invite everyone else. But we would gather the parents who trust us, the ones we know. So we gathered all the teachers, formed, a sort of council and put together a curriculum. And in fact, during those months, from March to May, the children studied and didn't miss out on anything. And when we had already moved to a safe and free territory that was liberated, our young son was able to continue with his important studies. And we saw, thank God, that it was a truly remarkable and incredibly significant achievement at that time, that the school did not stop its operations. Another story from our history, from our church. On September 11th, 2022, a significant and tragic event took place that completely brought about the end of the physical existence of the historic church located within the city of Melitopol. During the quiet morning service, armed soldiers suddenly broke in, quickly surrounded the entire building, and strictly ordered everyone present to stay exactly where they were in their places. Well, and so on, the rest is well known. The ministers were gathered in the office and sent for interrogation. There, searches began. They turned over books, rummaged through things, dug around. I remember this question: where did you get these books? Just don't say you ordered them on the internet? A very stupid, strange question. And where else can you order books in a modern, normal country? Then one of them, well, most likely, it seemed to me that it was him. He stood out somehow, he was different. Ideological, most likely, maybe from the FSB. And he was rummaging, digging so thoroughly, trying to find something there. I don't know, maybe they were looking for some reason to shut down our church, or something like that. Or was it just a farce? Like, I don't know. And it doesn't matter. But he was so happy that it seemed to me he almost jumped for joy. He shouts to his partner, look what I found. The other one looks as he passes the gate and doesn't understand anything. He says that's Turchinov, but the other one looks at him and isn't happy at all. That's the bloody pastor who was killing children in Donetsk. Something like that, yeah. And it's as if he found some kind of treasure there. Of course, in Ukraine, there are as many books as you want, and for the church too. Now, don't tell us that you are that extremist church. It is all remaining very ambiguous and difficult to interpret. From our collective perspective, it doesn't just seem extraordinarily peculiar and baffling, but distant. I remember the Soviet past. I remember when it was forbidden to have books at home, they were hidden. Parents would acquire them somewhere, pass them on. Books were even copied by hand. But in the modern world, for it to be impossible to read, it's actually even quite hard to imagine. And absolutely any kind of literature at that. The occupation began, and there was this unfamiliar feeling, actually not so much unfamiliar as something I couldn't quite identify at the time, what exactly it was. Because it seemed like it was there, I could feel it somewhere, but it was like a forgotten feeling. We were captured very quickly. In fact, like I said, almost nothing was destroyed. This isn't Mariupol, which was completely destroyed and where people went through a very difficult time. And gradually, during the occupation, some markets started operating, shops, some supplies, things like that. Well, of course, there were a lot of soldiers on the streets, a lot of unpleasant things like that. But it seemed like life was stabilizing. And of course, it was an occupation. The occupiers tried to show that everything was peaceful, that everything was fine. But for some reason, when it was 5 o'clock, the city became deserted. You understand, it's a southern city, it's always bustling. There's always life there, even at night. People go on vacation, there's some kind of trade, stores are open around the clock, and so on. And there wasn't, well, somehow the feeling of freedom and everything was gone. But I started to analyze what it was, what it could be. And, I remembered my childhood. I'm from a pastor's family. It was a very significant one, dating back to the Soviet era. And my father was constantly being dragged in. The KGB, or as we called it, the KDB, but back then it was the KGB. And I remember very well this childhood feeling when my mother would gather us. My mother would gather us to pray because she was afraid that I realized then that my father wouldn't come back. That very same chilling feeling came back to me again. It was fear, just pure, overwhelming fear. Fear for my loved ones. And this is what I realized later when I calmed down, when we had already left, why I don't want this. And I wouldn't want any child to ever experience this in their life. The fear that even in peaceful times their father might not come back, or someone else from their family. Why? Because someone thinks that faith or whatever else, you have no right to this. Actually, you simply have no right at all to raise your own children in whatever way you might see fit. I communicate with our people in the occupied territories, and I found confirmation of this. They testify to the same thing. What people truly and deeply actually require in their lives: restoration, help, and there will unfortunately be a lot of work to do, because many such unfamiliar feelings have appeared in our daily lives, feelings that perhaps we don't even notice right now, but which are already affecting our lives and are shaping our future, unfortunately.